Everybody watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast, welcome to the McConnell Center. My name is Gary Gregg. I'm the director of the McConnell Center, and this is a real honor for me tonight to be able to introduce someone who I hope to call a friend at some day. I'm calling an acquaintance now because we've just met 5 minutes ago or so. But Alan Harrelson is with us tonight to continue our year exploring variety, left and right. And tonight we're going to be exploring the thought of the Southern Agrarians. Alan Harrelson is from Darlington County, South Carolina, originally. He went to the University of South Carolina and then got a master's degree from the College of Charleston and a PhD from Mississippi State. He wrote his PhD on the Southern Agrarians, 1920 to 1960. He currently teaches graduate students at Liberty University, and that remotely because, you know, as the old saw is, people that aren't from Kentucky that migrate to Kentucky like me got here as fast as we could, and it didn't take me as long as it took Alan to get here, but he left South Carolina. How long ago, Alan? Last year. He's only been here a year in Kentucky, but he comes from South Carolina. Has moved to eastern Kentucky, bought a 220-acre farm in southeastern Kentucky, and he is now homesteading on that farm. I came to know who Alan was because of his YouTube channel, which is called The Pipe Cottage, and it's dedicated to all things pipe smoking. My son Jacob introduced me to it and said, "Dad, I think you're going to love this guy." The first video I was introduced to was a video of Alan smoking a pipe, talking about one of my intellectual living heroes, and that is Wendell Berry. And the next video I watched, he was talking, reading from the economic textbook of one of my other most important intellectual heroes, and that is Russell Kirk. And I said, I have got to meet this guy. And so we started a small correspondence, and I thought the Southern Agrarians and his perspective is something we've been missing in variety left and right up until this point. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Alan Harrelson.
Thank you. Well, I am so pleased to be here. Now, you will have probably more South Carolina represented here tonight than you will Kentucky. But I have grown to love this state. And I have come to realize, as a good friend of mine from Virginia, Patrick C. is his name, once told me, Kentucky is the new face of the old South. It is the quintessential American state, in my opinion. Now, I lived most of my life in South Carolina, and I came to know about the fugitive agrarians, the Southern Agrarians, and Southern Agrarian ideology at a fairly early age. Probably 17 or 18 years old, I began reading it in detail. And I can tell you, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Louisville, Kentucky is not my forte. I nearly about had cardiac arrest driving into this town. It is a city, and I don't like cities. So I contacted my wife, and I told her, I said, "Honey, just hang on. I'll be home tomorrow. Please pray that I can survive Louisville, Kentucky for just one night." It's a beautiful place, but there's a lot of folks. Bless your heart. Bless your heart. Now, I don't know how much exposure any of you have to Southern Agrarianism. I know that a couple of you in here do have a great deal of exposure to it, but it's not uniquely Southern in many ways. So what I want to talk about this evening is, what is Southern Agrarian thought, and why should we care about it? Why is it something that we should be continuing to read many decades after the manifesto, so to speak, of Southern Agrarianism was published in 1930. It has never been out of print. I wrote my dissertation not only on the Southern Agrarians, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit, from Nashville, Tennessee. I wrote my dissertation on a wide variety of writers and thinkers who were interested in this seismic shift between rural to industrial society that happened in this country from 1920 to 1960. The historian Jack Temple Kirby once argued, I believe in the late 1980s, that a seismic shift happens in American history when a majority of the country moves from rural to urban society. Now, when I approached my dissertation, I approached it from the perspective that if one is raised in an urban environment, your worldview is going to be somewhat different from somebody who's raised in a rural environment. And as the country moves increasingly towards a more urbanized way of life, what it means to be an American and historical consciousness, how people view the American past, begins to change. The fugitive agrarians is what they are often called. And this is a movement that began in the 1920s, and it came about while agriculture in the United States began to dwindle at a noticeable rate. Historian David Danbaum shows how from 1900 to 1920, the golden age of agriculture saw average farm incomes double, farm values triple, and the overall prosperity and discretionary income increase for farmers across the country. Now, I'm not going to try and hide my bias in this. I believe in farming. Cato the Elder, in his preface to On Agriculture, said that to be called a good farmer is one of the highest accolades that a man can achieve. And so, I did not come to Kentucky and buy 220 acres for no reason. I love a life on the land, and so I am somewhat sympathetic towards this Southern agrarian point of view, and I hope to show that it maintains relevance in the year 2023. So this historian Danbaum found that in 1900, American farm families produced 60% of what they produced. They produced 60% of what they consumed, I should have said. By 1920, that number dropped to 40%. Now, this is the material reality of what's going on the ground in American agriculture prior to the movement that we call Southern Agrarianism. During the 19-teens, in part because of World War I and the devastation it created for the European landscape, prices of American farm commodities, including southern cotton, increased substantially, allowing farmers to buy more consumer goods. Now, I have often wondered whether Kentucky is primarily southern or primarily something else. But I would have to say that in Louisville, I cannot speak to that question. I would very much like to get your insight during the discussion tonight about what exactly is Louisville, Kentucky in the general discussion of American regionalism. So I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. After World War I, city workers earned 30% more than rural families. Successful farmers grew bigger while further mechanizing their operations. And I worked on a row crop farm in South Carolina for 3 years. Actually, that's how I paid my way through my master's program. And it was a successful operation when it came to row cropping, but they didn't grow anything for the family table. And so bear that point in mind as we move to a discussion of what Southern Agrarianism may look like today. The USDA calculated that a farmer would need to tend over 100 acres to justify a tractor purchase. Most farms in the 1920s South were considerably less than 100 acres in size. We have this image in our mind of the South being a place of moonlight and magnolias where you have a plantation of 1,000 or more acres. The fact of the matter is, most farmers, including farmers in the South and across the country, worked parcels of 100 acres or less during the early 20th century. Farms between 50 and 175 acres declined by over 200,000 between 1900 and 1920. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? It matters because there's a shift in economics happening in the United States from 1900 to the end of the First World War. And the only reason that matters to me in my own research is, as I said, a person from a rural background almost always has a different perspective on life than somebody who has never experienced farm life. Now, that is a point of argument, but historically I think that is proven to be the case, particularly in American history. Some 6 million Americans left the countryside during the 1920s. 6 million. That is the largest internal migration in American history. And a large part of that involved Kentucky, particularly eastern Kentucky. In eastern Kentucky, beginning in the late 19th century, the coal mines and the timber industry began to provide jobs for a lot of families who wanted to move off of the land. When those jobs were no longer available, these people migrated to places like Detroit, Michigan, and Chicago, Illinois to find what was at that time called public work. So this is the context of what's going on when this thing called Southern Agrarianism, the fugitive agrarian movement, comes about at the end of the 1920s. And so I'm going to leave the term fugitive agrarian off the table for a moment, because where that name comes from will take a great deal of time to explain. For the time being, let's just call it Southern Agrarianism. John Crow Ransom wrote the introductory statement of principles to this book published in 1930. And this is a book written by 12 intellectuals and writers from the South who are in some form or fashion, most of them affiliated with Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And so the reading for the discussion tonight that I chose was Ransom's introductory statement of principles. Now, there is some debate as to whether he wrote it by himself. I don't think he did. A couple other people probably helped him, but John Crow Ransom was an important professor at Vanderbilt in the 1920s, and he was a mentor, so to speak, to many of the other writers involved with this publication. So Ransom explained the book's purpose in the introductory essay. This is Ransom. All the articles bear in the same sense upon the book's title subject. All tend to support a Southern way of life against what may be called the American or prevailing way. And all as much agree that the best terms in which to represent the distinction are contained in the phrase agrarian versus industrial. Now, historians have debated for decades whether this is an appropriate way to distinguish North versus South, either in the 19th century or the early 20th century, agrarian versus industrial. In my PhD comprehensive examinations, I was asked the question, were there not good farmers in the North as well as the South? Were there not good people living on the land in other parts of the country and other parts of the world? What is uniquely Southern about any of this? And I think the answer is provided by this introduction itself. None of these people ever said that we are the only ones. They said that we are interested in joining forces with other people around the country and around the world who are interested in maintaining an agrarian lifestyle. I will say this before I continue. Andrew Lytle, I did not know personally many of the people. I did not know any of these writers personally. I was born in 1986, and save for the exception of Andrew Lytle, who died in the early 1990s, I never would have been able to meet any of them. But I have met many people who either were taught by these gentlemen or knew them personally through correspondence or through some type of academic work. And let's take, for instance, the life of Andrew Lytle. I think it was Emmy Bradford, another disciple of Southern Agrarianism from Oklahoma. He taught at the University of Dallas for a number of years. I think it was Bradford, if I'm not mistaken, who once said that the agrarian Andrew Lytle, born in the early 20th century, lived to the 1990s, the end of the 20th century, witnessed more change than any generation in the past 300 or 400 years. Think about it. David Danbaum, the man who I've been quoting, has perhaps written the most comprehensive history of rural America to date. And the title of his book is entitled Born in the Country. And he gets that title from a historian in the 1950s who simply stated the United States was born in the country but moved to the city. Americans in 1920 and 1930 probably had more in common with Americans in 1780 than they do us now, because of the extent to which the economy has changed from a primarily agricultural one to one that is highly diversified, and where we have this idea of professions. The idea of professions in the economy, and particular careers and majors that you take up in universities, is a fairly recent development in American and Western civilization history. So back to Ransom. The book called on young Southerners to reject what he called the American industrial ideal and to look very critically at the advantages of becoming a new South, which will be only an undistinguished replica of the usual industrial community. For Ransom and for these people we are calling the Southern Agrarians, they thought that the South still had a high degree of distinctiveness. There was something distinctive about it. Actually, I think Ransom wrote the first essay in this collection, and he argued that the South has held on to European customs more than any other part of the country. And when I think of that, I immediately think of G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if any of you have ever read G.K. Chesterton, one of the most influential Christian thinkers, Catholic thinkers of the 20th century. And he visited Tennessee in 1914. And in his essay entitled What I Saw in America, this is just 15, 16 years before I'll Take My Stand is published, Chesterton says in What I Saw in America that there's more of old England in the old South than there is in England herself. So what Ransom is essentially saying is there is still something distinctiveness, there's still a degree of distinctiveness in the rural South in the 1920s. And Alan Tate, another one of the agrarians, said that the South in the late 1920s found itself at a crossroads, having to decide what elements of the past to take forward to the future. What elements of the past can better inform the present to better inform the direction of the rural South for the rest of the 20th century. Because you must remember that at this point in time, capitalism was being challenged a great deal. The Great Depression was just getting underway when I'll Take My Stand is published in 1930, and there are many people in the United States who are questioning the validity of capitalism, of free market enterprise. But we'll get to more of that in a minute if I have time. According to Ransom, an agrarian society produces the best forms of the amenities of life, is what he called it, including conversation, manners, hospitality, family, religion, and the arts. The essay concluded that a rural society is far superior to other forms of society. And please bear in mind that this book was heavily criticized after it was published. But also bear in mind that unlike many works of similar caliber from the 20s and 30s, this book remains in print. People still read it to this very day. This is also Ransom. The theory of agrarianism is that the culture of the soul is best and most sensitive of vocation, and that therefore it should have the economic preference and enlist the maximum number of workers. Do you realize that less than 1% of the American population today is involved in any form of agricultural work? That is astonishing to me. Tom Landis was a great friend of many of the Southern Agrarians. He passed away when I was in graduate school. I met him a couple of times, but I knew several people who were great, great friends of him. He was a Southern writer. He taught in South Carolina for a number of years. And I won't go into his career, but Tom Landis wrote an excellent essay which was published by the American Conservative several years ago. And Landis says this, read, I'll take my stand. With perhaps one exception, these are tough-minded essays in defense of a way of life that still existed, not just in the South, but in other regions. Communities of small towns that lit the landscape like galaxies of stars across a vast nation. One of my favorite agrarian writers from the 1930 period was Donald Davidson. Donald Davidson was a native Tennessean. I put a whole chapter in my dissertation about him. I think he is, if not the most important member of this collection of essayists, he is certainly among the most important. By 1935, this book, I'll Take My Stand, had received a great deal of criticism. And in 1935, Davidson wrote an essay entitled, I'll Take My Stand, a history. Listen to what he had to say. We consider the rehabilitation of the farmer as of first importance to the South, the basis of all good remedial procedure. And we therefore favor a definite policy of land conservation, land distribution, and land ownership. And Davidson goes on to argue that for small industry that produces fine goods involving craftsmanship and art, that's what we should promote, small industry. The agrarians are not saying in the 1930s or even in any other decade of the 20th century, their disciples, etc., what have you, that industry is unnecessary. What they're saying is that it needs to remain small, it needs to remain local. And even yourself, think about it. There's this local food movement going on now. How many of you would rather buy a fine artisan piece off of Etsy than go to Walmart and buy a piece of plastic? There's something about this that connects with humanity. You want quality-made items. Industry has a place in an agricultural society. That's what Davidson is saying. But it needs to be qualified. Davidson says that we should propose legislation to oppose corporations and mass production of what he called coarse goods and cheap gadgets. My grandfather could speak to that issue. My grandfather had a pipe pouch that I'm still trying to find. Mama says it somewhere. I declare I'm trying to find it. But if that pipe pouch is still around today, that means it lasts 70 years. And I would challenge anybody to make me a pipe pouch today that can last 70 years. Alan Harrelson, a historian who some of you may know, I don't know, he has written about what's called new agrarians. And Harrelson differentiated American agrarian writers after 1900 from agrarian writers of the 19th century, who historians tend to call Jeffersonian Republicans. And so Harrelson suggested that agrarian writers such as Liberty Hyde Bailey, and these are not Southern people, and Ralph Borsardi, as well as the fugitive agrarians, constituted a movement that, quote, sought to preserve the family unit as the foundation of society. And this is a theme that Andrew Lytle would continue to write about through the 1970s and the 1980s. If you don't have a solid family foundation, then there is no basis for civilization. And that's one of the main reasons these people are interested in cultivating an appreciation for rural life. Life at the home, life on the homestead, life in the countryside. It was their opinion that that is the best environment in which to promote family life. And I tend to agree with them. I tend to agree with them. And I'm on the fringes of the academic world, so I can say that. Southern Agrarian Thought remains historically significant for the way it helped shape an ongoing conversation in 20th century America about the place of rural life in the future of this country. A lot of people across the country, not simply the Southern Agrarians, were asking during this period, the early to mid 20th century, what is the future of rural life in the nation? The Roosevelts asked this question. I'm directing an excellent master's thesis right now, as a matter of fact, on Theodore Roosevelt, in the way in which land conservation was a major part of his political policies. And so a lot of people across the country are thinking about how to best preserve land, farm life, because industrialization is happening far more after the Civil War than it ever did before. What I argued in my dissertation, actually, in part, was that the Civil War changed the South, but not nearly as much as the Second World War did. It is the Second World War where the country moves out of the Great Depression, and by the end of 1945, the country is producing over half of the world's manufactured goods. And what that does for Southern society is it produces, for rural American society on the whole, produces more jobs that were never available before. And I'm not arguing that that's necessarily bad. What I am saying is that people are moving off of the land, and when that happens, there is a break in tradition. There's a break in inheriting the land that Grandpa cultivated, inheriting the lifestyle that Grandpa had, if that makes any sense. To various degrees, there were other writers and thinkers of rural America who tended to sympathize with the basic idea of agrarianism as voiced by the Nashville writers. I want to tell you about a Kentucky writer who was a student of Donald Davidson at Vanderbilt. And this is a man who deserves far more attention now, particularly among Kentuckians, than he is currently receiving. His name is Jesse Stuart. And I see some nods, so I hope other people have heard of Jesse Stuart. I put an entire chapter in my dissertation about Jesse Stuart because I wanted to show that Southern Agrarian Thought is much, much bigger than what happens with this one book of essays published in 1930. It's much larger. Historians and literary critics have concentrated on this one 1930 publication and the people affiliated with that. But there are many people who come from Kentucky that were influenced by this 1930 book of essays. But I just want to talk to you briefly about one man, because the title of this talk is Kentucky Contributions to Southern Agrarian Thought. And so Jesse Stuart was from Greene County, Kentucky, Ashland, Kentucky. And I have been to his home, and let me tell you a little bit about him. When he was born in the early 1900s, I forget the exact year, 1906 or something like that. It's been 4 years since I defended that dissertation, so some of this can be a little hazy at times. But 1906, and he was born to the son of a sharecropper. And he decided he wanted to become a writer. And he was a very successful writer at that. By the time we get to the end of the Second World War, Jesse Stuart is virtually a millionaire. He wrote a book during the Second World War entitled Taps for Private Tussie, which is essentially what some people call a Beverly Hillbillies type comedy about life in the mountains. It was very well received. Sold over 1 million copies during the Second World War. And up until fairly recently, it is my understanding that Jesse Stuart literature was required reading for grade school kids in the state of Kentucky. And Stuart was a school teacher himself. He often taught in high schools and middle schools. He was a school principal. He visited Scotland on occasion. He was heavily influenced by Scottish writers. And one of his grandparents was a Confederate veteran. His other grandfather was a Union veteran. But he, being a student of Donald Davidson, tended to sympathize more with the more southerly direction. He wrote an essay on John Fox Jr. for his master's thesis. John Fox Jr. was an important Appalachian writer before Stuart's time. And there was a building fire at the Vanderbilt campus, and Donald Davidson's apartment was in that building, and also Jesse Stuart's apartment, and his thesis burned in the fire. And so we do not have that for our records anymore. But Stuart is remembered for probably his first book entitled A Man with a Bull-Tongue Plow, which is a collection of poetry. And Stuart vowed when he started writing poetry, and when that book was published, that he would buy every acre of land that his daddy ever worked on as a sharecropper. And he did. Stuart purchased over 1,000 acres of land in Greene County, Kentucky. And when he died, he gave it to the state, which most people don't know. But why is he important? Why do I even mention this man? He and Donald Davidson maintained a correspondence until the year Davidson died. And so let me talk to you a little bit about why I think you should know about Jesse Stuart and why he is historically significant within the context of Southern agrarian literature. He invested agrarianism with his own values. He worked as a financially successful writer between the middle of the 1930s and the middle of the 1950s. He suffered a major heart attack in the middle of the 1950s when he was delivering a lecture at Murray State University, which I think is in the southwest corner of the state. His writings centered on rural life, and as I said, he sold over 1 million copies during World War II. His career was motivated by an intense desire for Americans, especially young people, to find value in agricultural and rural ways of life. He knew full well the limited education available to rural youth. He had a passion for educating country people. And he worked diligently as a school teacher to better the education system of Eastern Kentucky. He believed strongly in the power of education to shape the future of young people, but more specifically, he believed that rural life should play a respected and leading role in the future of the United States. So he had that in common with his mentor, Donald Davidson. So set during a period of American history when many throughout the rural United States left farming because of economic struggle, and there were good reasons why people left farms during Stuart's life, and he knew that. But his career underscores the degree to which agrarianism worked as a plea for rural communities to preserve the cultural and aesthetic value of rural life by embracing a national shift to greater economic diversity that included career choices for people so that they could have greater financial stability, but which did not leave farming on the back burner. I imagine that if Stuart were here today, he would be pleased with the local farm movement that is gaining ground, and especially here in Kentucky. Many people who are farming now have outside sources of employment. And this is what Stuart was trying to promote. He said, you don't have to farm exclusively. Just don't leave it on the back burner. And so this is the message in part that he tried to provide to the youth of Kentucky during his lifetime. So he was writing during a time when agriculture failed to offer financial security to many Americans. But he entreated people to appreciate the beauty of country life, not simply the economic gains that can come from it. So, to study the history of agrarian thinking as an academic or a political activity does not help explain why Stuart matters. He didn't write to engage political or economic debates, but he was a relatively wealthy man. And he didn't have a problem buying consumer goods just as well as anybody else did. But what mattered to him and what mattered to many of the people involved in what we are calling Southern Agrarianism is that at least younger Americans will develop a proper appreciation for the rural heritage of this country. Stuart, as well as his agrarian forebears, found the changing role of the farmer in American society to be very problematic. And his writings worked against this transformation. In his discussion of the early 20th century history of rural America, again I'll quote David Danbaum. He describes the change this way. For most of the history of the country, rural had been normal. Urban was what was peculiar. The typical person was a farmer. The atypical person was not. According to American mythology, the farmer was the paragon of virtue and the backbone of the republic. And I'm sure here he is thinking of Jefferson's republicanism. Jefferson, who said farmers are the chosen people of God. Those who did not farm were in some way deficient, says Danbaum, which I think is an accurate description of America transitioning during the early 20th century from primarily rural to primarily urban. And actually, the first census where we have most Americans are urban is 1890, which is much earlier than what some people may think. A significant transformation occurs because farmers became peculiar. And why does any of it matter? Why does any of it matter? We still have farmers today, do we not? We still have people who are working the land. We do. But there are more tires working that land than there are people now. This is a 1934 poem I want to share with you from Jesse Stuart, and then we'll move on from him. This is your time to sing while the ox cart is rotting in the chipyard and the cattle yoke decaying in the woodshed of dry rot. This is the time to sing songs of your heart. You see, America that used to be is fading, fading to eternity. Rural America remains an important part of American life, even now. I wish I had another 2 hours to talk about this. This is such a big, big topic. You can't go through it in just one lecture. Y'all need to start a course on this, you hear me? How Americans identify, let's bring it to the current day. Why is it relevant? Now, I'm not one of these people who thinks we should study history simply so that we can relate it to the present day. But I do want to leave you in the next few minutes with some ideas about why a study of Southern agrarianism and agrarian thought across the country on the whole during the 20th century is something we should care about as we're moving into the 21st century, trying to decide, who we are as Americans, because this question of American identity is probably more debated now than it ever was in the 20th century, ever was since the foundation of the country. So I think a part of that conversation needs to be the role of the rural heritage in who we are as Americans or Kentuckians. The geography of the American landscape indicates a shift in how Americans now identify with rural life. A shift that 20th century agrarian writers help us to understand. They chronicle it. They explain it. One good piece of literature can tell you more about the history of the time in which that piece of literature was written than perhaps 1,000 history books can. Vacationers and nature seekers make their way to state and national parks all across the country. Tourism communities such as Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, which is a god-awful place full of But all the while, these people are they're making their way to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and they're passing by the beautiful barns and the beautiful farms and don't care anything about it. I'm ready to go to Dollywood, praise the Lord. Yeah, okay, go to Dollywood, have a good time with all those people. When I was coming into Louisville, I have not traveled from Lexington to Louisville very often, but I called my wife when I was on the road. I said, I have figured out the style of barn we're going to build. We're going to build us a Kentucky barn. This is beautiful country. I didn't want to come to Louisville. I wanted to stop and talk to that fellow who was working the horse right there next to the highway a while ago. There's still a rural America, but people don't stop to pay attention to it. Don't stop to pay attention to it. Rural identity has less to do now with agriculture and the real work of farming than it did in past decades. For many people in 21st century America, people tend to identify with rural life through consumer products, through the consumer culture. The outdoor activities that we enjoy on the weekend. We go hiking, we go fishing, we go hunting, which are million-dollar industries, billion-dollar industries. We listen to popular music about what country life is supposed to represent. But of course, if you ask me, any country music after Hank Williams is pretty well trash. Now, the national population remains overwhelmingly urban today. Many still dream of a home in the countryside, however. The fact is not lost on me that my wife and I have been extremely blessed. When we first got married, we didn't hardly have 2 nickels to rub together. Now we have what I still consider to be the American dream. A piece of land that's big enough for me to raise my family, for me to put food on my table. And that's what matters to me more than an academic career. But that's just me. The dream of a rural life seldom includes agriculture as an occupation anymore these days, however. So, in their quest to find continuity in rural identity and to make sense of a national shift to industry, Southern agrarian writers during the 20th century contributed to a much broader intellectual conversation that worked in response to the modern decline of rural societies. There are other Kentucky writers I could talk about. Elizabeth Maddox Roberts, for instance, who was from Springfield, Kentucky, who was heavily influential on the Southern agrarians. Caroline Gordon, wonderful writer. James Still. I mean, if any of these names are familiar to you, then great. If not, look them up. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but there were other people in other parts of the country. In Mississippi, you have people like Walker Percy and William Faulkner who are chronicling rural life in the lower South. And then you have Robert Frost in the Northeast, who is also chronicling rural life in that part of the country. Out west, Aldo Leopold is writing a great deal of information about land conservation and the importance of that topic. So it's not just the South. Louis Bromfield from Ohio. I've been to his farm. It's a beautiful place. It should be in Kentucky, though. So this is a broad discourse, which we've only got a few minutes to even touch the tip of the iceberg about this evening. So since the close of the 20th century, Americans have continued to debate the place and the meaning of rural identity and agrarian values in the life of the nation, pitting their views against industrial agriculture, environmental degradation, and the need for immediate gratification that comes with an intensive consumeristic society. So this agrarian renaissance can still be measured today by the longevity of certain homestead and farming magazines such as Mother Earth News. They've been in existence for decades now. The persistence of Wendell Berry and his wonderful reputation. He's still writing now. And I would argue that Wendell Berry is perhaps the most important American writer that's currently breathing. But people are looking not for simply an agricultural life or even an agricultural life. They're looking for an agricultural moment. Just a moment. It's not really a part of who we are anymore, which I think is rather disgraceful. I want to return to Tom Landis for just a minute before we draw it to a close, because I want to have time to talk and visit with you wonderful people. Going back to that article I mentioned from Tom Landis, The American Conservative. This is how he ends the article. The agrarians are all fading names now. He's talking about the Nashville 12. 12 men who shared for a while the illusion that they could stop the inevitable unraveling of a traditional society. They predicted the future, and no one listened. Andrew Lytle said in his last years, "We were better prophets than we knew. Things are worse now than we ever imagined." The problem was no one believed that the society they knew could ever be taken from them. Now it's gone forever. Perhaps the greater tragedy, according to Tom Landis, is that people today don't even know that society existed. Thank you for your time.